So I'll start by saying that because I have worked with some very different characters in the psychometric world, which includes Ray Cattell, who I hosted seminars for 3 years in the early 90s, with Will Schutz, who is quite different from that, and with Peter Saville, who gave me my first job in this area. I like to think it gives me a rounded view of what psychometrics is about, although not everybody agrees it's rounded because they don't like what I say. All right, but I see myself as having really been a practitioner and certainly an author, but also a critic. And with that, I mean, recognizing what we're doing, I'm going to start with wondering about where you are with this, because basically people who get engaged with the idea of psychometrics, some of them do it with a great advocacy. They enjoy it. They see them as useful, sometimes too useful, etc. And you may see yourself as an advocate, etc. But there are clearly people who are hugely cynical. And I completely identify with people who are from that camp, but sometimes that cynicism is from what I believe is a misrepresentation or misunderstanding of what psychometrics really is. Hello? There's someone ought to mute, I think. I'm hearing someone else. But I should think that there's within that, there is what I call the explorers, the people who have some idea, have some opinions, but are open to thinking about how much do they overdo it, do they underdo it, you know, should they be thinking more or less, what else is there out there, etc. And Stuart, you said that you could get people to actually put little tags on here to show where they think they are. I don't know if this is a good time to do that. I don't know how long it would take to educate.
Yeah, no, I think it's a great thing to do. So what I'd like you to do, if you're on a normal PC or a MacBook, if you move your cursor, on mine it's to the top of the screen to get to view options, and click on annotate. So there's like a hidden menu in Zoom. So view options, annotate, and then you'll see a function called stamp. Click on stamp. And if you think you're an advocate, like I think I am, I want you to click on the heart and go and stamp it over by advocate. If on the other hand, you're a cynic here, then maybe you can select a cross and go and put it over here. And if maybe you're an explorer, you can select a tick and put it in the middle. So it's just a chance for us to see interactively what people on the call, you know, where we're at. Are we advocates, explorers, or cynics? Can everybody find it? Sometimes if you're on a Chromebook, it doesn't work so well, or at all. It just depends on your setup, whether it works well with Zoom. Okay, so we're getting a few views here, and Sue Colton's typed a name in. Yeah, so that's another thing you can do.
Someone's put a star in.
Yeah.
Whatever that means. Okay, so great. We don't need, I mean, we're not doing a quantity count on here. It is useful. It's a nice feature. I didn't know about this. Stuart just told me about it before we joined. And with that, then, I would just say that basically, I think all of us, whether we're cynics or advocates or whatever, have a desire to add value to the people that we're engaging with. So with a common desire, but with a different lens on all of these. And I would like to, first of all, say, I don't know if you, thank you, Stuart, to say I am an advocate, and I need to put that up front, because people, when they hear me criticizing psychometrics, sometimes think I wouldn't advocate them at all. So let me just give you a quick summary of what I think are the main reasons why they're useful, which is that they do provide a structure for what people are saying. And maybe a double-edged sword is that they provide a level of stability or consistency to what it is that we're looking at. But also, we know people are fascinated by the idea of how they compare to others, and that is always of interest to people. And finally, and I suppose for this audience in particular, the fact that, you know, with psychometrics, we actually have data which allows us to do things. It feeds into, if you like, one of the clarion calls that we have as a profession, which is that we are evidence-based practitioners. So it helps us to move beyond opinion into some kind of evidence base. Now, having said that, there are things that I'd like to say, which is that I'm not an advocate of them being misused, overclaimed and misunderstood. And that's what I'm doing in terms of saying what is wrong and are we going backwards? Because from Shakespeare to Gogglebox, if that's what attracted to you, you may have understood the message behind that, which is 450 years ago, we had people writing things like Shakespeare, and now, you know, people were going to theatres to watch this, the public were doing that, and now Gogglebox is something which I don't think quite makes the grade in terms of the quality of what we're doing. And I have the suspicion that in some areas we're going backwards, and that's what I want to explore. And what I do get really frustrated with is that I think some of our technology, some of our language, some of the things that we have to offer have been hijacked by the highwaymen in the profession. And we need to be careful about that. So please, in all the things that I now say, recognize that I am an advocate in spite of some of the things I'm going to say. So moving on then. In saying there's a backward trend, we have to have some idea of how we're going to measure that. And I thought of how we might structure that. And I'm going to structure it in terms of, well, first of all, very topical, recognizing that not all progress is good. And David Attenborough, I think, sort of epitomizes that. The progress that we have as a civilization is causing a lot of harm. Okay. And I think then we need to think carefully about what we think of as progress and what is going forward and whether it really is an improvement. So I'm going to split that up into, you know, progress in terms of the input, okay, and then progress in terms of the output, and progress in terms of what goes in between the input and the output. And I'm going to say a quick thing about each of those before I go too much, because we are making progress. So again, I want to remind ourselves of the positives in all of this. And the positives in terms of the input, I mean, I have had, you know, 100 people in a room and had to administer tests in the old pencil and paper format, you know, and that form of input, if we look at what we do now, it's quick, it's easy, we can do it with attractive material, we have easily accessible data. All of those are great positives. And just as an example, you know, we use pictures now. We didn't do that in some of the old printed matter, etc. And we are going to be moving more and more into animations as well. So I think there is progress that is being made and possible there in the input side. But a question I've got is, on the input side, what should we be measuring? And I've put the periodic table up there because that is something which I think we need to question, because, you know, the whole sort of alchemy tradition and looking for things and then the identification of fundamental elements that are important was a great breakthrough in the physical world, and it could and should be something that we are aspiring to. And when we look at then, I mean, I'll use a different analogy, but the idea of when we bake a cake, we can actually look at the basic ingredients of it, okay? And those basic ingredients allow us to construct all the things that we want to see. That is a very, very helpful model. It did fantastic things in the physical, in the chemistry, you know, in the physical world. And if you like, the pioneer in that was Rigour. He was looking for the elementary ingredients of personality. Now, why I think that we are going backwards is because what we're now seeing more and more is that people are finding really nice words that people like. Ooh, persuasive. Yeah, I'd like some of that, please. And I find it so frustrating to hear so little analysis about what that word actually means. And if I look at what that could mean, it could mean a whole host of things, or more likely, a multifactorial concept. This is not elements. This is multifactorial things. You cannot be persuasive without a degree of verbal fluency. You cannot do it if you've got bad judgment or bad analysis. And you're never going to persuade anyone unless you can take a position. So there's all of those, and it doesn't stop there, because we can now go to another level and say, well, verbal fluency involves a degree of confidence and reasoning, etc. And it gets more and more, and it's a tangled mess. Okay, but what I think we've gone backwards in is just being satisfied with simple high-level concepts that give us an idea that we're getting something real, but we're not. So if we go back to the analogy, we're going from elementary ingredients to nice cooked final product. I'm going to a wedding, give me a wedding cake. I got a salesman, give me persuasiveness. And I think that going to complex finished products like that, you know, we are moving backwards, because we used to have people who are trying to be cooked, and now we just go and buy the ready meals. And I get very frustrated then with the way in which we are measuring high-level concepts and then asking people what, you know, the rigor of our item content. Where is that rigor? What is that rigor? And I find so often it is limited to correlations, internal consistency. That's rigor. I don't think that's rigor. And I've looked at some of the best known questionnaires that are out there, and I'm just going to use one. I don't want to pick this one out as being particularly bad, but you know, I prefer to view the big picture. Okay, what's that telling me? And I often start conversations with strangers. Okay, so these are just 5 items from the HPI. And what are we doing there? That one's about preference. That one's about behavior. That one's about attitude. That one's about motivation, etc. So I do not see a good rationale for the way in which people populate their questionnaires and choose these. There's no rationale in these manuals. What they are is, we've got good internal consistency. That is a travesty of, you know, trying to understand the human condition, which is where I feel we ought to be. So that's my point 1. Are we making progress? I'll come back to more of that in a minute, because there's more things to be said, but just doing a quick one on the input and then the output. Yes, we're making enormous progress on the output. When I look at the reports that I have had on file, they were so unattractive, and now, I mean, I used to spend hours writing reports and they didn't look very good. Now they're quick, comprehensible, attractive, and they're getting more and more interactive. So there is good value there. I mean, what we've got with our reasoning tests, you know, people could do the reasoning test, they can interact with it, they can look at what they got wrong, they can see why they got it wrong. You know, there's a lot of stuff there. And when we look at that in terms of things like our values questionnaire, the interaction is making it much easier for people to access. So yes, tremendous progress on the output, although the questioning of that output, what is the real quality here? I mean, how much, you know, when I get 30 pages of stuff, you know, from a few questions, and it seems to be overloaded with interpretation which doesn't quite really fit the justifications. I think the ease of it means that people are stopping to think enough about the output and to challenge the output, because they are only algorithms. And I know that more and more people say, oh, well, the algorithms are better than people. They're still not better than people. And finally, what goes on in between, which is our realm as psychologists. This is our home territory. And this is where I think the abuse is even higher. But basically, in between, the accessibility of data means that we can produce loads of things that will impress people. But whether they are valuable, I severely question. One, just to quote one, global norms. I know when the Hogans produced the global norms, they had 3 people from Iceland, 10,000 people from Brazil, you know, 200 people from XYZ. I mean, It was a global norm because it had some people from all over. What was it telling us? And people they look for big numbers rather than really understanding. So the accessibility of your data, we can do a lot with it, we don't do the right stuff with it. More varied data sets, brilliant. We will have words, pictures, videos, real life observations. I'll say a thing about real life observations and AI at the end of this talk, because that's too big a topic for me tonight. But then there's also the easy, sophisticated analyses. And, you know, we put these things in, we put in a factor analysis, which the authors probably understand to some degree. The people that they're giving it to probably don't, and it's not analysed. And yet, you know, now we can push a button, get something out, and we almost fit into an orthodox way of doing this stuff, which doesn't necessarily add value. So, potential for progress, massive. Actual progress, not as high as I would like. And I'd like to make a point, because all of that analysis seems to forget the fact that we are using numbers. What kind of numbers? Hard numbers. Most people think that's what a hard number looks like. It's a difficult equation. But what I mean by hard numbers is in comparison to soft numbers. And I'd like to illustrate what that is. What are hard and soft numbers? And for that, I'm going to give you an example of when Will Schutz was invited into NASA, who were having problems. They have had problems, and they had, if you like, they identified it as a problem with being open and managing the mistakes, etc. So he was asked to do workshops for a year, and a basic question was, how open are you? And he did a design, which was a pre and a post assessment. And after a year of workshops, and it wasn't just one question, it was elemento, so there's more sophistication to it. But in analysing the before and after, there was an enormous hope that basically the results would be the workshop started there and then they ended up there. The result, in fact, was after a year of workshops, the scores had gone down. What does that mean? That the workshops were a failure? If they looked at it qualitatively, and they did, what they found is that the people in the workshops, through the workshops, had suddenly realized that what they thought was openness previously wasn't openness at all. Openness was willing to give people a bollocking, was willing to just say how you feel. Real openness is much more challenging than that. And once they realized that, then they realized when they did the questionnaire again, they weren't open enough. And the decrease in the score actually meant an increase in openness that had been achieved, but they now had a different benchmark. And that's what I mean by the way we use these numbers. They're soft numbers. So to summarize that is that basically the benchmark can change. And using self-report numbers, we have to recognize that a 5 is not always more than a 4. As in that previous example, the 4 was more than a 6. Okay, and the meaning of the words we use can be different at different times for different people. And I'm going to say a bit more about that. But I'm going to now structure that under what I call the 4 dilemmas. We have a language dilemma, a context dilemma, a change dilemma, and a scientific model dilemma. Okay, and I'm going to focus first on the language dilemma. So dividing this into 4 bits, I could, and I will, at this point, invite any reactions or thoughts as to where I've got to now. Either you can do this in your chat, or you can unmute and say something. And if too many jump in together, Stuart will deal with it.
Yeah. So chip in, unmute and speak, or if you wish to raise a hand or put a comment in the chat box. Anton has a nodding head. I think that means he agrees. Yeah.
Okay. Well, look, Stuart, there'll be other 2 opportunities and one at the end for this. Okay. All right. So let me go on to the language dilemma, and this will connect back to what I was saying about the simplicity of our questions in questionnaires. But look at this. I mean, Walter Mischel, you know, he's been sidelined, but my goodness, did he do some good thinking? And when you look at it, look at the, I mean, this is the kind of question you get, I like change, agree, disagree. Well, let's just assume that all of these people give it a 5. Yeah, I like change. What the hell do they mean? I wear new clothes every day. I like change. You know, I want to get a new job every year. I like change. I think we should overthrow the government. I like change. I mean, when you use a high-level concept like change, like persuasiveness, you are tapping into very different things. And to be honest, we then give ourselves a great trick that we can do with psychometrics. What we can do is say, look, they're all pretty stable. They say the same thing again and again. Their idea of what change might change or might not. I mean, let's imagine that I think I'm persuasive, but my idea of what persuasiveness is or means changes. I come back to the question, yeah, I'm still persuasive, but in a different way. I mean, what are we getting with this is quite limited and does not justify some of the hard number stuff. And in Shakespeare to Gogglebox, I'm saying that I think that we're throwing stats at this to impress people at soft numbers which don't justify it, but we're using it to justify it.
So Roy, there's a comment in the chat box about, and I think it means, would this not be picked up with a lack of criterion validity? So if it says I like change, which is, I agree, you know, really high level and general, but if it's so general it's not meaningful, will that not be picked up and there won't be any good numbers for the criterion validity, perhaps?
I tell you what, you will get some numbers for the criterion validity, but that criterion validity will not be worth the, you know, paper it's printed on. I'll come in onto that under the sort of scientific badge later on. But yes, it is a good point. It's a very important one because it's another one of the clarion calls. We've got validity. And I would challenge that on most of the things that are out there. But anyway, words are fuzzy set, so we need to take care. Doesn't mean that we don't get something useful out of them, but we don't always get what we think we're getting. So, what does self-report reveal? I mean, I love this. Instead of thinking we are measuring, objective, that's what we do. We are the objectifiers of people's reality. No, we're not. We're asking people questions, and the way in which then a person's verbal reply to a question is a puzzle to be understood rather than an answer to be interpreted or a prediction to be made, I think changes the ball game. It changes our attitude to what we're doing. And you think about that back. So you said you're high on change. It brings in curiosity. I wonder what this person means by change. And in my training, I say again and again, if you just think, use those 2 words a lot more, I wonder you'll be in a better place with the data that you've got and the person that you're dealing with. So, reframing what we're doing with self-report. With all of them, basically we're saying, tell me about yourself. That's what we're doing, let's be honest. We are not doing an objective x-ray of your insides. We're saying, tell me about yourself. And a chat can be very useful, but it doesn't quite give us the structure. What we've got more with a questionnaire is more like a kaleidoscope. What we've got is hundreds of bits of information, and you twist it into a pattern, and that pattern has some shape and form, and it gives us a chance to bounce from that into more. And the more that that pattern is based on a good theory, then the more value it is. But I see so little good theory in this field. We'll talk about the big 5 later if you like, because I don't really see that as a theory or a good theory, just a way of structuring things. Yeah, quite useful. But I do like the idea and thinking of self-report as a metaphor, as a microphone. The times I see people who just get engaged with this and find themselves listening to themselves for the first time. The microphone is there saying, did I say that? I can see that. Yeah, that's a good way to put it. people learn from this because it's structuring things, because we're not very good at that, structuring things in a way that adds value. And it's a two-way process, because a microphone allows me to be heard by others. What a great way in a short time to say something about that you can look at, but also then to hear myself. So I like those metaphors. And what I'm doing with the questionnaire is structuring how I experience myself. That's such a, it's not just more useful, it's just more real. That's what we're doing. Are we pretending to ourselves with our objectification in psychometrics? So what should we be asking? If we were asking in science, what are the fundamental elements of nature? What are the fundamental elements of human nature? What are they? And I think that really we have run away from this from the very outset of psychology, where it began, which was that we're talking about experience. I mean, let's be fair. When we're asking people in a questionnaire to answer, what are we saying? We're saying, tell me how you experience yourself and the world. Tell me about that. And the experience is what defines us as human beings. Our neurons don't define us. Our hormones don't define us. What defines us is our experience, and that creates the interactions that we have. That creates the dramas that we have, the emotions that we have. So we shouldn't sideline people's experience. We should bring it center stage. And I think we are helping that if we use psychometrics correctly or better. So it means changing our mindset, because the implication of all of this is that we no longer take what I call the selection mentality to this, which is then cut right across all of psychometrics. I mean, why? I suspect most of you say to people, give the first answer that comes to you. Why? When you do a questionnaire, I find that so demeaning. Do you know what it does? It means that people basically get encouraged to say the same thing and what I was saying 10 years ago. And it leads to higher internal consistency, higher test reads, wonderful stats, but it's not real. I myself found that some of the best information I got was when I paused and said, Roy, that's what you always say. Is that really true? It's not really, is it? I mean, if we see the use of questionnaires as part of the process of awakening and engaging and self-awareness, because most of this is about self-awareness, then we don't say give the first answer that comes to you. We say you're allowed to reflect on where you are now. It may not be the story you've been telling before. So that's one thing. It's an orthodoxy that I hear very few people say. When I say to people, I think you should think about this when you do the questions. They say, no, we don't. We shouldn't. That's not the received wisdom. Well, I'd like to change that as received wisdom. And also this thing about what you do in the average of situations. Why? Why? I mean, that's so difficult. I mean, I've got a slide later on coming up, and it's The Godfather, Marlon Brando. I think of the situations in which he was so caring for his own family and so destructive. What is his average? I mean, average, there's a real danger with average. And we've built it into some of our questionnaires. I don't agree with that either. And it also raises the question, which I'm going to come on to, which is about whether behaviour is really what we want and an average of our behaviour. More on that later. And then that one that I'll deal with these later. Think of yourself at home with your slippers on. That's the real you. Is it? Why? Okay, more on that. That'll come back later. But if we think about it, I would like us to approach psychometrics by inviting people to think more carefully, reflect more, and think about the way in which they express themselves, present themselves, think about themselves, but also to think about perhaps, and this is what we do with our resilience questionnaire. We ask them, typically, how do you respond to this kind of situation and this kind of pressure? And what about, when initially this was under the title of, typically and under pressure, but under pressure has got two elements to it, because sometimes pressure is positive and sometimes it's not. So we have to extend it and say, when it's under pressure, typically stretch and stress. And that then just came together, and they're features of the RSQ, which means that we then have far more interesting reports. It's not that I'm average on sort of optimism and self-belief. In self-belief, typically it's quite high, but it does go down, and it goes down a lot when I'm under stress. And then you get the people who under stress become far more optimistic, a very unusual pattern. And the data that we have on this, just, you know, we can pick out those unusual things and explore them and try and understand what the person's telling us. I mean, I do not see why we are still in that realm of saying, Likert scale 1 to 5, one mindset, averaged across all of these things, when people deserve more respect than that. So I think we should challenge people more, and there are 2 key ways of doing it. One is to challenge people by what they are saying, and what we've done with our values questionnaire, I'm going to mention them because I'm trying to address the criticisms, but this person had said that influence was not that important to them, but another way of looking at the way in which they answered the questionnaire, it rose to the top. And when you looked at it compared to other people, it was their highest one. They did not recognize it, but you can do a lot. And we've introduced some new psychometric ideas in doing this, but we can pick up then on just what you say yourself and pick up on where there are inconsistencies and question you about why is that moving from here to there. Maybe you're not aware of that. You know, maybe you didn't realize and you think this, but you don't follow through on that. This is one of the most sophisticated tools that we have, and I think one of the most powerful. But we could do so much more than giving people a profile on a Likert scale. But the other way in which you challenge self-report is the obvious one, but people have not done it. They've gone from self-report to, well, they ought to get someone else's view. Let's do a 360. 360 is tedious. People get tired. It can be hugely valuable, but sometimes people just get fed up with it and they just give bland answers. And I found it much more useful to do a paired process. Pick someone useful and ask them to do the questionnaire about you. And then you can see, right, well, I think, you know, here, but my other thinks here. And that paired process to me has been one of the most useful, because what you do is more than just give people more data. You change their whole attitude of engaging with the process. I'm no longer going to say, we've got it for the values questionnaire as well, paired process. Well, I think, you know, legacy. I think transcendence. How does Mary think of it? Isn't that interesting? She doesn't see that at all. That introduces so much curiosity by the person themselves before they even do the questionnaire. Anyway, so those are ways of making things, but I've said there, then the language dilemma, there is a big issue with the language dilemma, which ties in heavily with the hard numbers, soft numbers dilemma. So this is a pause for comment, flags, or whatever, and kickbacks and saying I'm being unfair or whatever.
Okay, so what do we think, guys? Feel free to unmute and just pitch in or type a question in the chat box.
I don't know whether you can hear me now.
We can hear you.
Again, I suspect it's going to come later because I can't wait to hear the other sections there. But I've been intrigued, and perhaps Roy has too, as to not just why we've ended up at the Gogglebox end of that, but actually what are the factors driving that. I've got a number of thoughts on that, and I don't know whether this is the right time to do it, but I am struck, if you like, by the need that every Tom, Dick and Harry consultancy has to create their own IP. And I'm just wondering whether a lot of the issues and the drive towards either the bland or the far from deep is because amateurs in some cases there, or just the strong desire to be not someone else's psychometric test is pushing us toward, and also to do it as cheap as possible for the end user, is just driving us into this cacophony of offerings, many of whom are not substantial in their structure or consistent in the way in which they approach these issues and deliver the experience.
I do agree with you, Anton. It's what I call the flight to superficiality. I think there are many drivers. I think that the way in which, I mean, first of all, there's the sort of nanosecond click mentality. I want it quickly. You know, when I used to write reports and now I can get it just like that. And I almost don't, and I know the training's different now. People just get their report and they're learning to use the report rather than thinking deeply about what's behind it. So there is that, and the quick and the easy. But I think the quick and the easy is something that is also, because of the way in which we have touch button factor analyses and things, we can make things look like there's a lot of depth to them when there isn't. And I think this is the job of our profession, and we are not coming up to the plate. As psychologists, we should be calling this out, and yet too many of the superficials that you're talking about are psychologists.
So Roy, I wonder what you'd say to me, because I've been working to improve a psychometric that I work with, which has got good factor analysis and good Cronbach alpha, and in the improvement and getting the linguistics better and the coverage better, the Cronbach alphas have got worse and the factor analysis has taken a small hit. So I guess, am I up against what you're talking about here, striving for the standards that are established, yet bumping into, I think, the language dilemma and possibly the context.
This is why we've got to do it. I mean, it cuts across people who are really trying to understand the important things of the human condition, which will not be neat. Okay. And I think that what you've got there, Stuart, I mean, if you are getting lower scores, I'd love to look at that, Stuart, because I think it may well tell a story of improvement. It may well, but we need to be able to tell that story, and we have not got the platform, or, I mean, the resistance from psychologists, you know, from psychometricians to this is so huge that we are fighting uphill with it. Yeah, I quite agree.
Yeah,
so
really interesting, very interesting. Yeah, and very
two questions.
relevant.
Go on, we can pick them more at the end, but I feel I'm aware of time.
Okay,
so anyway,
let's keep going.
Keep going. I want to challenge the one sector of, if you like, the criticisms of existing things, which is that there is certainly a school that says we should make most things behavioural. I understand that words are flaky, you know, and self-report is flaky. We ought to make it behavioural. Now that then goes into, should it be behavioural in terms of self-report, or should it be observational behaviour? Okay, but I think no one that I see is addressing the issue which we need to, which I'm going to come on to. Okay, but first of all, before that, I want to make the point of, what does behaviour tell us? You put a fly on the wall in this woman's kitchen and looked at what she does and then said, oh, okay, that's the limit of what she has to offer, potentially. Okay, and certainly, and I'm using this as an example because I had the good fortune to work with women returners, and these women, their biggest thing was, I am just a housewife, and the lack of confidence they had. We were in a process of building confidence, basically. And one of those, you can do it by reframing what they're doing. Okay, you're not just a housewife. Look at what you're doing. You are researching child development, for goodness sake. And you've got a continuing program of research. And it's one of the most demanding jobs in the field of psychology. Okay, and you work long, I mean, blimey, that's a lot. But reframing like that didn't actually work. Okay, but what we need to recognize is that basically all of us are limited by our context. We are caged by where we've been and where we are now. Every single one of you that I am talking to has not yet got to the bottom of your own good and evil, potential and limitations, because you haven't been challenged. We are challenged, even in this COVID climate. I mean, I feel I have not been challenged by this COVID because I've got a garden, I haven't got 3 kids running around in a flat with nowhere to do. And I tell you what, I have not been challenged in the way in which our client who go in the UNHCR, they deal with refugees, and you look at what they do, not only how the refugees are challenged, but how the people working with them are challenged. I mean, we are all limited by what we have done. And so I want to ask the question then about, if we ask people to express how they experience themselves at work, supposedly this was progress. This was Shakespeare to, this was Gogglebox to Shakespeare, wasn't it? Instead of having very strange items in the questionnaire, just think of yourself at work, tell me what you do. And therefore, is there such a thing as a work personality? I'm only using him because I got the pictures, okay? But is he a different person here and there? Well, maybe we should take another person, him. Was he a different person there from there? That's Charlie Chaplin. I mean, look at it. Every single one of us, we do play many roles. Should we consider people at work? Are we similar or different? We often trivialize that as a question. I'm different at home, at work. Well, let's respect that comment, because people are. Behaviorally, they are. They may not be as a person. So how do we get around that? We get them to average it. I mean, let's remind ourselves, all the world's a stage. We play many roles. We should explore those roles and see what they tell us about our inner being. So I'd like to reframe this territory a bit more, to get a bit more clarity, because there's confusion, which I'm going to come on to. But the clarity is that when we talk about personality, we are talking about things inside the person. We are talking about the things which I take across circumstances. But there are always circumstances. There is always a demand out there that is saying things. And if you like, there is always a tug of war between one and the other. And behavior is what is the result of that tug of war. And sometimes my inside wins out and I do it in spite of everything. Sometimes the outside wins out. But you don't average things like that. You understand things like that. I think this is a really useful thing which has not been done, except by what we're doing with some of our stuff. Which then brings me back to this question of the confusion that has been generated by the OPQ, the work personality. What does a work personality mean? It means what I do at work, how I think about myself at work. It's at work, I'm different at home. And what is a role? Is my role in a team? What team? What team? Well, any old team, really. All the teams I can think of that I've ever been in. My take on that is that basically OPQ is a role questionnaire. It's not a personality questionnaire. It's a high level list of competencies, and you're asked to survey it as if you were at work. That's not personality in my book. A role, to me, is behavior in context, not an average across context. Okay, it limits the context to teams, but really we're talking about averaging like that is some kind of team personality. But do you see, I mean, whether you agree with me or not, I think this is loose thinking. I look at where have they rationalized this? Where's the theory that has led to say, this is what we're doing? I mean, what I get so upset with is the fact that everyone is claiming rigour. And one of my talks a few years ago was, is it rigour or rigor mortis? Stuck in old models. So what happened to context? And luckily, I'm not a lone voice in this. Jerome Kagan, his very first chapter in this book is Missing Context. He lambasts psychology, and I lambast psychometrics for ignoring context. You look at all the things that we've got out there. Which one of them talks about what you do in context and how that differs from, you know, when you're here or there. So I'm not alone, and I think there is significant criticism that we've got to place there. Now, my way of dealing with this, because it can get hugely complicated, has been the development of what I call the four selves model. I often like to present this to people before they do any questionnaire, because I say, think of yourself. There's the you present, and there's the you inside you. But what would happen if Don Corleone came into the room? You know, he played many roles, but I tell you what, I would behave quite differently than if he came into the room, because I have different expectations of the context, or him. I don't want to go into the politics of this, or her. This is one of the things I found so interesting, because I got my daughter to do the TDI, which is type dynamics indicator, about me. So she did the paired version. I did it, she did it. She sees me differently from the way I see her. I asked my wife to do it. She sees me the same way as I see myself. What is that about? Not that one of them's right or wrong, or that I'm wrong, but the different parts of me glow in different contexts. My daughter brings out aspects of my person, my personality. Okay, my wife brings out other bits. We've got to recognize that we have got these different tones in these different contexts. And then this averaging it all down to something generic, and it's a 5 on a 10-point scale, to me doesn't suit well. So I talk to people and say, look, there is a contextual self, and there are probably many contextual selves. I get people to do our role questionnaire in a work team, in a different work team, in a leisure situation, a role in the family, a role in the family of origin. They can change, and it lightens up people's understanding of how they adapt to different situations. And if they do that before they do a more general, deeper questionnaire, they've lanced the boil. They're no longer thinking, well, yeah, here and there. Now, well, they think, okay, because this is what I say to them. Behind all of those contexts, there's a sense of who you are, what I call the identity self. That's what we want to get at. So when I'm asking people to do the TDI or, you know, the VBIM or whatever, I say, think of the identity behind the many roles that you play. And remember, successful people are very good at playing many roles. Think of the you behind it. I never got confused when I played Richard III that I was Richard III. I always knew I was Roy. You don't have to go and see the video, by the way. But anyway, extending beyond that, another hugely neglected area is the concept of the ideal self. The ideal self is a massive part of people's psyche. If you're in the business of self-awareness, if you're in the business of self-development, other development, helping others, knowing the difference between the identity, how I think I am really, and who I want to be is massive. Of course, I learned that from Will Schutz, but I've adapted it to the TDI, and the is-want version of the TDI, so a bit like a Myers-Briggs, but 3/4 of the population report a difference between the identity self and the ideal self. That is huge. It shows you that this generalized averaging, thinking of yourself at home with your slippers on or whatever, doesn't work for the real question that's going on inside people's minds, which is the person that I sort of see myself as and the person that I want to be. So we ask the simple question, the way it is and the way I want. And people feel, you know, I've heard people say, well, what's that? How important is that? It's probably more important than your sense of your identity. The person I want to be, and I'll come on to that a bit later with another way of thinking about that. And the undiscovered self is always there. The undiscovered self, because do you know, at the age of 21 that I am now, I still know that there are things in me as yet unfathomed, and they will come with the right experiences or the right try will come. So let's remember where I am does ask what I do. So that's the context dilemma, little question mark in case there's any. 2 quick comments there before we go on.
Roy, I just put a comment in the chat, but I was wondering if you saw the cyber self, the way people behave on Twitter or Facebook, how they portray themselves there, as something over and above a contextual self.
Well, I wanted to come to that in terms of the AI question, but more as a discussion, and I think we should maybe take it at the end of the day. But clearly, there's a lot in that. But clearly, like self-report, there's a lot of managing of that as well. And the idea that we are going to get, know enough by algorithms to get through how people are managing it, because people are clever. They start managing it, we have algorithms, we manage the algorithm. The idea it is going to give us the objectification of who people really are when they don't even know themselves, and that we're going to know it just by seeing how they walk and what they said on Twitter and all of those things. I think we're expecting too much. There's a database there, there's some useful stuff there, but there's an ethical dilemma there, a massive ethical dilemma there. Can we come back? Yes, let's have that. I'd love that conversation, because I'm not clear where I'm going with that at the moment. So shall I carry on?
Sure.
Yeah, let's keep going.
The change dilemma, I'm going to make this one short. Because, why? I don't want to get into the nature-nurture debate. I mean, do things change? Certainly things change. If we're thinking about experience as the fundamental unit, my experience does change, yes. How much does it change? I don't know how much things change. I'm not sure we metamorphosize. But one of the things that I found really interesting with, it was Will Schutz who said this to me. He said, people have a great capacity for change, but they generally find it very hard to do because people get locked into something. The fact that people get locked in doesn't mean they can't, it's that they don't. That's a big question. And maybe we can open the door on that. But basically, the idea that we are measuring, I don't deny there are genetic components to the way in which we are. I've got twins, so I'm able to observe that objectively and say, yes, I know they came out different, they behave differently, they react differently, but they change. And I think one of the things is how important, what is it that changes? And when we start talking about, well, 80% of it's genetic, I was the consultant for a film once, a film called Link, in which Terence Stamp was going around with a bunch of chimpanzees saying, those chimpanzees, only 1% difference in our DNA. That 1% is the difference between swinging from the trees and landing on the moon. So when people say it's 80%, I'm not interested in that. It doesn't tell me anything. What I want to know is, if 1% can mean that difference, what is it that we can change? That's a more useful question. So let's go back to saying what we're doing with our questionnaires is we're giving people a microphone, they're expressing themselves, and the way in which I think and talk about myself can change. Whether my DNA is holding that back or not, I'm not interested in that because we're nowhere near being able to address that. But as a microphone, yes. What I'm saying is that we help people to be heard, and we help people to write the next chapter of their life story. As a coach, I see what I'm doing is not usually helping people to understand where they're coming from. I'm helping them to understand where they're going. It's about the direction. More on that in a minute. That's enough on change. We'll come back to that. I want to address the science dilemma a little bit. So our clarion calls, reliability and validity. This is what gives us the punch, isn't it? We can claim it now. We've got reliability. What do people expect when we say our test is reliable? Hits it right on the nail. It's accurate. You know, I got your height there and I got it accurately. But we don't get that, do we? We know we don't get that. What we get is consistency. Consistency. Now that is not the same thing. Consistency is a correlate of accuracy when we have things that don't change. We made the assumption with ability tests that that's not likely to change, so it was an acceptable model. Who said that personality, that values should adhere to the same model of consistency? I don't think it should. Certainly values, no. Values do change. And yet we're applying this same model again. We do not get accuracy, we get consistency and stability. That's only a correlate. And we should know as psychologists that correlates are not the big thing. Correlation is not causation. We know that. Let's come on to validity. Ah, there we are. It's not only accurate, it hits the right target. This is the question you asked earlier, Anton. Yeah? Or, no, Stuart, you were saying about, you know, criterion validity. Well, I think very often we're hitting the wrong target. And why do I say that? Because basically it's the wrong model of validity. Now, I know this is going to upset people, especially if this goes out there beyond this group, but why do I say that? Can anyone think about why I might say that? It's because the underlying model that we are pulled back to in psychometrics is stable, unchanging, consistent. Okay, we are using a validity model that then says static measure here that doesn't change against static criterion there that doesn't change, and that doesn't work in the real world. In the real world, actually, that static bit there is not accurate enough. You know, the fact that someone can say they're persuasive 10 years on, although they have changed their concept of what persuasiveness is, doesn't mean it's accurate, okay? And the criterion, I mean, that's a massive issue. What are the criterion? And we pick little things that, so I'll come on to that. There's more to be said on that. But what we are offered is basically, I mean, I could in an afternoon give you a test that would touch the buttons on reliability and validity. I could do it. It might take a bit longer than an afternoon to get the data gathered in, but basically I could ask 100,000 people, are you persuasive? Okay, hold on. You will get, I've actually done this. You do get a range of scores. Great, we've got a range. We can differentiate between people. Okay, all the issues I've got about what it means, put those aside for now. Now the hard bit. Assume that I can get a measure of persuasion effectiveness. Is Donald Trump persuasive? Am I persuasive? Are the people down the road persuasive? You know, what is persuasion effectiveness? We might find a little area. Very often it's an assessment center where someone had a bit more influence than someone else, and that's it. And well, let's say we get one, which we can sort of live with for a bit. And I do believe we do get that sometimes. What do? I can guarantee I will, with these two things, give you a small positive correlation. You'll get one. I could do that in an afternoon. That small positive correlation doesn't convince me one bit. Because basically I ask you if you're persuasive, all right, in the gravitational pull, more of those who are a bit more will tend to have bigger scores than the others. But if I now use that to go and find a person in the middle of that bunch, there's nothing I can say about the person in the middle of that bunch. Nothing. I mean, it's far too accurate. And what we are doing, we are taking broad generalizations with very low correlations, you know, validity coefficients, with dubious criterions, and then applying those to individuals. You can't do that. So this is not rigour, but this is what we propose as validity. Validity's got to be looked at again. I looked at Rob Brinner's thing, and he said, yeah, you have to look at the science. But that's only one element of it. You have to look at practitioner experience and judgment. You have to recognize that people out there using this stuff know something. I listened to Jordan Peterson the other day, and he said one of his rules for life is anyone you disagree with, always assume they know something you do not. And yet us sometimes in our profession say we know it all. Anyone who criticizes it, well, they don't know. You know, they're the layperson. Well, we've got to listen. We've got to listen to the practitioner. We've got to listen to the stakeholders. We've got to bring in context to understand what we mean by validity. Onwards, philosophy. There is a basic issue with our whole approach. It pervades psychology. It pervades psychometrics. I don't know if anybody recognizes this. You should do. You've all done a little bit of behaviorism. That's B.F. Skinner. You're bound to recognize this man, Freud. Yeah. Both of those, so very big chunks of psychological thinking, are about a reductive view. What they are doing is they are saying what happened explains what's happening now. They are looking backwards. Okay, they are trying to explain how I became who I am today by looking at the past. And now, to be controversial, because some people really dislike this man, I don't, because I've read him. He is so misunderstood, mostly by psychologists. But Carl Jung, Stuart might go along with this, but Carl Jung, he is misunderstood. And people think because he talked about type, he's in that camp. He's totally not in that camp. Okay, he's got a constructive view of things. He is trying to explain who we are by our purpose in life. The big questions, you know, Viktor Frankl's, you know, a man with a why will endure almost anyhow. In fact, it was Nietzsche, not Viktor. I picked it up first from Viktor Frankl, you know. So look at this. This is fundamentally different philosophical orientation. How I became who I am today versus what I am becoming. Now, obviously, what I am becoming is part of that whole concept of, well, what am I saying here? You know, it's a completely different view of what we're doing. And when Jung developed psychological type, it was not as explaining how I became, but my compass. He calls it a compass for knowing where I am to steer me in where I am becoming through the transcendent function, which is to overcome the dynamic tension of opposites. If you're interested in more on that, there's a YouTube video which I gave a talk on the transcendent function. But it's not just him. I'm just saying that there is basically a bias in psychology toward looking backwards, that there is a massive benefit in looking forward, certainly us in the self-awareness and helping, you know, professions, the development of people. And so psychometrics I put in how I became camp. That's where we've been stuck. That's what we're trying to do with the TDI, is where I'm going. Where do I think I'm going? And is that really true? So in summary, the psychometric model, I think, has severe limitations for the material that we're dealing with. The validity model has got not only severe limitations in terms of the static nature, but it's got severe limitations because what is published is the bits that support the hypothesis. I do not see in test manuals the rigour that says I'm trying to disprove what I've got. What I find is trawling to find the bits that can give me a correlation which looks positive. It's a standard mistake. Why is our profession not calling this out more? And there's a great book, The End of Average. He's got some funny things in there, but basically there's some really useful things which challenges the idea of how we try and strip out individual difference. We do everything by averaging and generalizing. there is a place for that, but not when you're dealing with individuals. So basically, the field that started off as individual differences is actually about individual similarities. And we'll give you a few differences about those similarities. Do you see why I said we need to have some conversation about this? Because you can unpack these things ad infinitum. But I'll share with you a model which I've used to say, let's try and bring this all together. You know, the context is so important. We ought to do more with context. People's values are so important. We need to do more of that because we're dealing with people at many levels. Let's think about them in a multifaceted way. People's aspirations, we should be dealing with that. And yes, I do think that we have tools that can help get into these areas. Very amateurish. You know, I'm criticizing all these other, I'm not claiming that these are highly sophisticated, but what they're doing is they are pointing in the right direction. And I think we should stop talking about these separate things and look at what we're really dealing with, which is helping people with their sense of who they are, their identity. And all these things feed into it, and it will stop us being too narrow in thinking that I'm using DISC and I've got personality in a nutshell, or whichever ones you happen to use. So what have we covered? Quickly, numbers from self-report are soft, not hard. Words have different meanings. Behavior is not always an insight into the inner person. We need context to make sense of what people say. Some things may not change, but we are dealing with people's story about themselves, and people's story does change or can change. And use well, psychometrics provide a stimulus for launching people into the future. So I do like Shakespeare. What's past is prologue, what's to come is yours and my discharge. It focuses us on what is going to happen. So I'd like to leave you with a metaphor, which is that what we're doing in psychometrics, we get some nice pictures, but the reality is if you turn your volume up, we are dealing with something dynamic and moving, and we have captured it in a little black and white picture from one angle. We need more angles. So, is psychometric making progress? I think I've touched on all of those to a degree. Agree with it or not, that's where I am with my frustration, and I think that we as psychologists should be picking up some of this and doing more with it. So, thank you for that. And for our discussion, this is what I meant about getting people's information through AI in terms of their Twitter and their CCTV and whatever. It's an ethical thing about how we're spying on people unbeknown and using it to make decisions potentially. I know that's a direction of travel. I think we should address it. We should certainly enshroud it in far more caution than it is seeming to be at the moment. Thank you.
Brilliant, Roy, brilliant. So let's open it up for questions, comments. I know one or two people did need to leave, but we can continue with the questions for another 20 minutes or so, or as long as we need actually. So who'll kick us off with a question for Roy?
Can I butt in?
You can.
Roy, what in your opinion is the best questionnaire at the moment for bringing together both an assessment of personality but also values?
I don't think you should have one questionnaire. I mean, I get fed up with being asked so often, can you have a questionnaire? And they give me a whole list of competencies, and you know, they want it done in half an hour with one questionnaire. So the first thing is, be honest, recognize it's not as simple as that, and you won't get it. You won't get what you want. You'll get a profile that looks like it can, and you could do something with it. So I think we should use a questionnaire designed for purpose. I mean, for me, having used the main values questionnaire I used was the MVPI, which was sorely inadequate. And we had to address so many things in that. So I use VBIM. Obviously, I believe it because I've developed it. But if you want values, and that's a complex tool, you know, you won't get it in one shot, and it will challenge people in a way which they haven't even thought of. And they can do a paired version. So if you want to get into values, don't try and do it alongside. It's something to be done. And going back to that, you know, let's treat it like that and know that those values, I mean, that is actually supposed to be a drum. And it's the values are part of the container that determine the resonance of the context with the person. That's my metaphor for that. But personality-wise, there isn't a best one. There isn't a best one. I mean, we've got the TDI, which does things and looks at aspirations as well. It's a type measure, misunderstood. I would love to do a whole thing on type because I think that psychologists are, Rob Brinner, who I quoted earlier, disparages the MBTI for the wrong reasons. He's misunderstood what it is, in my view. Okay, and I suspect because he hasn't really studied it, he's taking our orthodoxy, the fact that 95% of psychologists will lambast it, and so, you know, yeah, it doesn't measure up on these silly things. So personality, I would use a range, to be honest. Fit for purpose, I mean, I've trained people in a lot. I know a lot of them well. I do the NEO, I do the, which is not necessarily the best, it's got the best reputation. I still use the 15FQ+, a 16PF, the TDI, the HDS, which is a lovely model, poorly measured. The measurement behind it is not good, in my view. I hope I'm not going to get sued for this. This is opinion, you know.
You're entitled to opinion. I think that's brilliant.
Yeah.
There's a question from Nick. Do you think the industry is doing more harm than good? Yeah. Or more good than harm?
I think that the mass use of it is doing more harm than good. And why I say that is because the mass is done, just flick out there, do a thing, bring it back, and then use it, often in selection. Certainly in selection. Certainly self-report in selection, I think, is appallingly used. Ability in selection, there's a good justification for it. These things used in development, they are being used really well. As I said at the beginning, I use them. There is a lot in the way in which it structures people's, you know, scattered thinking, the way it gives comparisons. All that can be good in the hands of a good practitioner. I think coaches tend to be amongst the best users. I think people trained along the BPS lines can be adequate, but I don't think the BPS process does enough in terms of understanding this complexity, because it's still stuck with understanding, you know, a bit about internal consistency and validity and criteria, you know, and it's got stuck in that, what I call a time warp. Legacy of Ray Cattell, by the way, I know that for a fact. Yeah, can I say any more on that? I mean, I can't say whether there's more harm than good. All I know is there is harm, there is good, and there's lots of mediocre.
Roy, can I possibly ask Stuart, okay if I ask a question?
Of course, go for it, yeah.
Oh yeah. So Roy, fascinating talk. I have to say, in terms of my practical use of psychometrics in individual context makes a whole massive amount of sense, as do your comments about reliability and criterion related validity, and I guess you could also say some similar things about construct validity. And I think so much of what you say is true. I suppose in the background there are the drivers. You know, the people have gone down this reliability validity route for a reason, because, you know, as a supposedly scientific profession, we need to basically justify ourselves and justify, you know, give credibility to what we do. And I suppose where do you see, if you kind of not dispense with those things, I'm sure you're not saying chuck, it's not the baby in bathwater, but certainly push those heavily to one side. Where do you see the kind of routes to establishing that kind of, if you like, scientific credibility, or do you think it's just not something we should be so obsessed with?
No. I mean, I do accept the evidence-based. I mean, I wish our politicians were all evidence-based than opinion-based. And I think in the world of human, you know, resources or whatever. People are opinion-based very much. So no, I want the development of good evidence, but I don't think we are casting the net wide enough. We're stuck in this narrow hole of what are the good psychometric indices. And I think we have a basic lack of respect for the complexity of the human condition. I think that, I mean, when I first read Psychological Type, I was just in awe at the way Jung was trying to understand what people are about. And I look at, you know, the psychologists producing psychometrics today, I see none of that. You know, I don't want to go on about Jung, others, you know, Jerome Kagan, you know, they are trying to understand and not coming up with just simple answers. We've come up with simple answers. So that's what we've got to address. Given that, so one of the key things in that, Rob, would be introduce more lenses. I often use, I don't think I used it here, I've got a slide which shows you a sculpture. And it's a Henry Moore. You take it from another position, it's something completely different. We've got to do that with people. Take you front on, take you side on, take you from underneath, take you from your innards. You know, people are more complex. And I think psychometrics has encouraged people to think it's simple. Look how it's done it in abilities. Oh yeah, verbal, numerical, abstract. Where's it gone? The human brain is more than verbal, numerical, abstract thinking. It's much more than that. And that is 90% of probably the psychometric market, those tests. I mean, that's appalling. And we are not helping people to break out of that. Psychologists should be the ones doing it. And I'm despair with the profession that I joined and believed in, that it is not doing its job.
Roy, I have a question for you, because I wonder whether you're at risk of being criticised by the hardcore psychometricians from the Psychometrics Forum and the BPS and elsewhere for, you know, letting go of some of those hard scientific standards as they might see it. But also on the other side, counsellors and therapists who often shun things that quantify and are reductionist and may still see some of what you're doing as too reductionist in the same way they'd view some of the other instruments you've criticised. I'm wondering what your experience is. Have you found a home for your perspective? With
the people that I find buy into this the most are the coaches, coaches and counsellors. I've actually, there's some some of this is in 2 videos that I've got on our website. You go to our website, which is entitled "Should Coaches Use Psychometrics?" And so there, I mean, ultimately, I think, yes, they should, because it brings some degree of structure and rigor and evidence to what they're doing. But the reason I developed those or did those was because so many of them said, I wouldn't touch that with a barge pole. And I'm trying.
So what would you say to a really humanistic therapist that doesn't believe in putting numbers on people at all? How would you persuade them that there's merit in this approach?
I would say, how, on a scale of 1 to 10, how far are you from thinking we shouldn't? Is it a 1 or 10?
Like a question or ipsative?
I'd use that one as a liquor, yeah. Because basically, you know, I mean, I've done brief therapy. It's brilliant, the scaling question. You know, I feel awful. So on the scale of 1 to 10, where would you put awful? Oh, it's a 3. How come it's not a 2? Do you see how that changes the conversation? Numbers are really useful. What would make it a 5? You know, you can do a hell of a lot with numbers. I mean, this is back to the thing I said earlier, understand people's benchmark and move it from there. That's why with the resilience questionnaire, in the end, typically I see myself here, there. That's not interesting. It's how I see myself moving from there, which is interesting, which is why we developed the resilience scales questionnaire in that way. So, and this does, Stuart, this does engage. Okay, I can't say I've engaged sort of the hard-nosed people who come as a cynic and they will not be changed. But so many people in my workshops have said, do you know, I came cynical and I can now see value. So I think it does, I mean, and maybe that's my preferred constituency, because I think they are more likely to use this in a more multifaceted, humane way than trying to be the objective. You know, I know people who are so strongly on the, I want it objective. Well, okay, I'm not talking to them. I won't reach them, I don't think.
May I put a question as well, Roy, and to go back to your philosophy slide, if we may, which I'm absolutely intrigued by and found very stimulating.
Which one was that? Oh, that one.
That one, yeah. And I'm just wondering whether, in a very simplistic way, what we have got here is this long-standing issue around the assessment and evaluation of potential, as opposed to the, which is about the capacities to become something more than you seem to be at the moment. Because, I mean, I'm aware, sort of rather long in the tooth, that there's been lots of debate about, can you measure this? Is it legitimate to do so? Are the insights got from potential measures telling us anything there? But their underlying philosophy seems to be that of the constructive, of the what am I becoming, or what might I be able to become thing. Is that just too simplistic a way of thinking about this, or does it sort of ring sort of true?
It is simplistic, but it's not untrue. You know what I mean? So, I mean, there is a point. You know, I don't object to the fact that, you know, we can measure things and recognise that some things are harder to change than others. You know, as I say, that in fact people are very hard to change. People are very resistant to change. You know, but the idea that if you want change, the person needs to want to do it themselves. If you want potential, the first thing that you've got to release is the energy to achieve it. It's not to identify objectively, oh, you can do it. It's to release the energy. And to release the energy, you have to get into then the, you know, what the person really wants. And that may be, it's back to the thing I said earlier. A man or a woman with a why will endure almost any how. Help them to understand why they want to do it, and they'll go through treacle to achieve it. And they may not have as greater competence as somebody else. I mean, I was an athlete as a young lad, okay, and it's really interesting is the people who made it, you know, athlete, English schools and what have you, the ones who made it weren't the ones who had the most talent, it was the ones who had the most determination. It was the second rung that did it. So yes, potential, and there is something about, you know, you don't, you know, want to train a chicken to climb a tree or whatever. You know, you've got to identify some things are very hard to change, but if you want potential, you have to work with the energy of the person and help them and yourself to do it. And sometimes you have to cut your losses and say, no, you're never going to make an Olympic athlete, Roy. And I didn't.
Hey, Roy, we've got a great question from Lucy about why do you think there hasn't been more challenge or pushback on the discrimination that psychometrics can have against age? I don't know if you want to add to that, Lucy, or whether I've said it well enough.
Right.
I think that's pretty much a summary. I mean, I guess in particular, I'm talking about the kind of more cognitive, spatial awareness, things like that. But we know that they do. We know that performance on those measures does reduce as people get older. However, that's actually not the type of intelligence that's particularly useful in the world of work, right? So world of work needs more, I guess, the crystallized intelligence of, I understand that if I behave in this way in this meeting, I'm going to piss people off, therefore I'm going to be a bit more mature about it. So yeah, I'm surprised that there hasn't been, given that everyone, I mean, every year we've got another 300,000 plus people entering the 50 plus demographic. It's one of the largest age groups, presumably seeking work, wanting to change jobs. And if we were to start initiating, I don't know, measures to select them, one of the things that people would typically throw at them is psychometrics. And I can't believe, for the pool of the size of people we're talking about, that there hasn't been more discussion or there hasn't been more challenge about how these things really can be quite age discriminatory.
Well, you're touching on something, I'm touching on lots of things actually, Lucy. One of the things, so various sort of thoughts there. One is that we have trivialized the human brain to verbal, numerical, and abstract reasoning. We need more strands, you know. There is more things there. And we need to decide what is important in the 50-year-olds. You give a 50-year-old a memory test, they won't do as well. Okay, yeah. But is it memory? No, it's not. Or is it a different kind of memory that you're looking for? So that's just a very simple example. But more strands is an important thing, and then better understanding of which of those contribute to what kind of performance. So we come back to some. You know, I mean, the whole criterion evidence base still has value, but we're doing it in too generalized a way. More specific measures, better criteria. So that's one thing. But the other thing I've got is this question of what we mean by discrimination. You know, and that is such a big topic. You know, and so.
Well, I mean, I do literally mean, you know, if you're going to apply for a job where there's any real degree of demand, as opposed to you apply for a job and you're lucky if one person applies, right? So for the ones that are really quite popular, you know, most of the approaches tend to be very, very low touch, but high volume. And it's always kind of espoused that these sorts of things are, well, at least they're fair, everyone's doing the same test. But, you know, as I say, we know that they age discriminate. And I'm just surprised. You know, we've all been very concerned, if you like, about, you know, making sure that it doesn't negatively impact people of different races or ethnicities, but we haven't really, nobody seems to have really been asking the question. And I think the potential to be in real trouble here is huge, right?
It is, but I think, you know, we are being very simplistic. I mean, lifting bags of cement is very discriminatory against women, you know, but some discriminations are differences that are relevant. So that's the question, is not whether there are differences, but whether those differences are relevant. And that's what we don't have the information on. We don't have enough information on that. So I just feel that, you know, we're turning the handle like the organ grinder of models which aren't fit for purpose. And we need to do that. And if we're not doing it, who else will? So, you know, Stuart's saying, you know, I might be upsetting people in our profession. I'm sure I would. I mean, I'm on the BPS committees, you know, and they know that I tend to have some opinions. But you know, where else can we do this? I do think we need to put our own house in order, be more challenging, and be a beacon for better practice rather than just churning the hand.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it sounds a bit pithy to say this, but just coming back on Anton's comment here, you know, there will be, I can see that this session has been recorded, so this will be available to members who want to watch the session. I wonder if you might also wish to frame, summarize, ideally not more than 700 words because people won't read it so much, but also possibly put this as an article and something we can put on the homepage of the website, you know, with a link to the longer, you know, watch the video if you want to read a bit, you know, hear a bit more about it.
Yeah,
that's a brilliant idea.
Well, we'll be doing a write-up for this session anyway, Roy, I think, so we can sort of work on that.
Well, I did one for the last one, and I've covered similar ground, but think differently. Sure, you're at the last one. Is how different?
No, I think this takes it further, and of course, and would be a great video, and would be great for an article for the ABP for sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I'm happy to support that as myself and Richard. Yep.
I must say as well, though, that in this forum, I am willing to be a little bit more vitriolic and challenging, because you know, if I can't be here,
where can you be?
You know, there's no point in chatting like this out there because I won't understand what I'm on about. But I would like as well to, you know, to point. I mean, the videos on my website, should coaches use psychometrics? Number 1, number 2 are, if you like, building to number 3, which is proposing solutions. And maybe that's something that, so I haven't done that one yet, but I've sketched it out. So
yeah, I wonder if, you know, maybe a better question might be, should companies be using psychometrics for selection? I get the coaching context easily. Yeah. Exploratory, discussion, analysis, all the complexity, enabling, facilitating, all of that. But it's incredibly reductive when it's just here's 30 seconds or 30 minutes online, answer as many questions as possible, and you'll be lucky if you get any kind of feedback report.
Well, I certainly believe that personality questionnaires for screening are wrong.
Mm. But then maybe that could be the article title as well, because then that is it's very, and as far as I'm concerned, how you're sort of saying in this forum, you'll be a bit more, I encourage you to take your voice to a wider forum, because almost in the same way that you're complaining about the, ameliorating everything towards the average, I think sometimes the things that grab attention tend to be when people are a bit more, what's the word, articulate. Aggressively articulate.
Yeah, I don't want to emulate the politicians.
Well, you can back up your points, Roy. That's the difference, right?
Thank you.
Yeah, a polemic approach to influence by making it really clear. It's perfect. Yeah.
Okay.
Right, Roy. If I could a quick question. You're involved with BPS test standards, yeah, or have been. Where do you see this? Do you think this whole FPER test standards movement, which has obviously gone on for many, many years, do you think it's actually been helpful, or do you think it's actually been counterproductive?
Sadly, I think it's been counterproductive,
yeah, because
we've now joined a bigger body that instead of challenging and trimming the essentials, is, mushrooms. So I started that process of saying we need to evaluate what we put into the training 10 years ago, more than 10 years. And it went through, EFTA got involved, and it became more megalithic than it was before. It did the opposite of what I was hoping to achieve. I'm actually on a working party at the moment in the BPS, and I've voiced some of these things already. But that's, a working group, not the CTS. And I don't know how receptive people are, because there's vested interest inside there as well. So, but yes, we need to do something about that. I think training is no longer fit for purpose.
Yeah. I'm certainly with Lucy, by the way. I think that, you have got a valid perspective, a well-argued perspective here, and I think we should be pushing it. And maybe, ABP is one of the things ABP can provide, maybe a forum for, off-centre thinking a little bit more than maybe the BPS does.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about the homepage of our website, it would just, as I say, an article is just an article, but very few people in the psychology world will even know that this talk exists, because it will be buried in one of the event page links for members, blah blah blah. Something on the homepage of our website is seen by 200, 300 people a day.
Okay, well, look, I do feel quite strongly about this, as you can see. So I'm happy to engage in ways that do this. I'm actually a consultant editor for the BPS review process, and I have to do it according to the rules. And the rules.
We don't love rules here.
But I for that, because it's a system, I have to follow the rules. And so what you review may come out with 5 stars, and it's not a particularly good questionnaire. It's not yet, and that, the working party is trying to address that, and trying to address the training. So there are small, but I know how slowly the BPS move. So,
Well, I'm also thinking we have our new podcast editor on the line here, who's kept it all very quiet, but I'm sure, Rob, you can facilitate, invite Roy, maybe get Stuart, maybe get Peter Saville along, get 3 people, future of psychometrics, or what's wrong with psychometrics, something like that. That'd be a great podcast episode.
Great idea.
Yeah. Well, so, ball's in your court now, right? Rob.
I'll make it.
See how I did that? Let's plant an idea. I'm not going to complete or finish it at all. I'm just going to delegate it to someone else.
That's your key skill, Lucy. It's your key skill.
It's probably genetic. All right.
Are we drawing today's session to a close? Is any final questions from anybody? Anybody wants to ask Roy? Well, in which case, I'm just going to say a huge gargantuan thank you, Roy, from the ABP. Really stimulating talk. Lots of positive comments from lots of people in the chat box as well, appreciating the challenge. So yeah, thank you so much for your time and energy. Yeah.